Hi there. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has capitulated to demands from her coalition partners after an insurrection over her migration policy threatened to bring down her government. So where does this leave Ms. Merkel's government? Where is the German political landscape heading? And what does it mean for the EU after just reaching a compromise of a migration policy? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Anna Tangen, who is an author and a commentator. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
After hours of talks with Chancellor Angela Merkel, Germany's Interior Minister Horst Seehofer announced an unlikely deal.
We have reached a clear agreement on how we can prevent illegal immigration on the border between Germany and Austria in the future. I'm happy we have been able to reach this agreement. It became clear one more time that it's worth fighting for one's convictions.
The two agreed to set up transit centres at the German border to prevent asylum seekers entering if they've already applied elsewhere in the European Union and if the other EU country agrees to take them back. Chancellor Merkel claims she too has stuck to her principles.
The spirit of partnership in the European Union is preserved. At the same time, we have taken an important step to control secondary migration, which was and is important to me. And that is why I think that we have found a good compromise.
The Chancellor had thought she'd already found one at an EU summit in Brussels last week. But at the weekend, Seehofer told Merkel it wasn't enough. The stage was set for his resignation. He expected his Christian Social Union colleagues to follow him. That would have meant the collapse of the coalition government. But by Monday, they deserted him.
There are many possible compromises, and I will hope this is still possible. One thing is clear. The stability of the government is not a question for us. And the parliamentary group alliance is also not a solution for us.
So by the time last-ditch talks were due to start, the CSU leader already looked all but finished. At one point it looked as though Horst Seehofer had the upper hand in this standoff, but now, as the Interior Minister arrives for a meeting with Angela Merkel, the question is whether he's here to seek further concessions from her, or whether he could be about to hand in his resignation without the backing of his own party. Then came the surprise breakthrough that there may yet be more trouble to come for the Grand Coalition. As its members gathered at the Chancellery, the centre-left Social Democrats forced a smile. But they have in the past opposed what's been agreed. It'll be their turn to speak out next. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Berlin.
Welcome to Dialogue, Anna. Now that German Chancellor Angela Merkel has backed down from her previous position on the issue of migration and agreed to establish border camps for asylum seekers, how is her political viability and that of her government?
Well, right now it's quite good. I mean, as you heard, this was actually a defeat for Seehofer. He was the one who was pushing this. He thought he had the support of his party, and in the end they deserted him literally and left him alone. So she's beat down one of her chief rivals, somebody who was potentially threatening to bring down her government or alternatively seek a different chancellor. So yeah, you should never underestimate her. She's been around for a long time. There's a reason that she's one of the longest-serving chancellors in German history.
And how serious is the problem, the challenge for Germans as well as German politics? How serious is the problem of migration for German politicians and their European counterparts within the European Union in Brussels?
I think it's extremely serious. I mean, if you start looking at the things that are kind of moving Europe along, I mean, the populist movements, it's first immigration, second the EU, and third is this kind of political correctness or liberalization that is running counter to what they believe. And you've seen this not only in Germany, you've seen it everywhere from Poland all the way to Scandinavia. So this is a real threat to the EU, I think, and it's going to take some very clever and pragmatic leadership, not only by people like Merkel, who has, in essence, decided that she needs to preserve what she can, but also people like Macron, who have perhaps a wider vision, but need to figure out a way of bringing people together.
It seems Angela Merkel has been anointed as a leader of a new liberal order after the election campaign success of Donald Trump. But is Germany now, too, buckling under the weight of far-right movement sweeping Europe?
Well, it's definitely threatened, but I mean, she's extremely pragmatic. And remember, she a few years ago she was talking about the fact that integration had failed, that the idea of people coming in and trying to change Germany was not going to work. That these people had to come in, they had to accept Christianity, they had to accept the Judeo-Christian order. Remember, her father was a pastor. She was originally born in Hamburg, and they moved to East Germany because he was motivated by his faith. She is also. So she's very wedded to this idea. So while she might have these kind of socialist liberal ideas about doing it, she's still very much in tune with the religious side of her things, which is evangelical.
Angela Merkel is no longer what she was after the crisis of migration or asylum seeking, but she deserves credit for humanitarian relief for those who have been left stranded in the turbulent overseas waters off the shoreline of continental Europe. But Italy is not happy. So are most of the politicians in Central and Eastern Europe about an open border for the asylum seekers. So what do you make of her popularity at this moment, and what do you think of her own political future?
I think her future is good. There's really nobody waiting in the wings to take over from her.
It doesn't mean that she's strong, but it does mean that she doesn't have any strong political rivals to challenge her position.
She doesn't have that, and she's also very pragmatic. She's the one who went to the EU and demanded that everyone get together and kept them there late into the night, trying to hammer out some sort of compromise that she could live with and that she could bring back to Germany. I mean, this is the mark of a leader, getting down at these clutch moments, being able to get people together and come up with some sort of solution. Now, it's far from clear how all of this is going to work. They've talked about these countries being willing to take back these migrants as they come through. But I think everybody in Europe now, regardless of what side they're on, realizes that this has become a lightning rod topic, that immigration, the way it was being put forward by Merkel, is no longer going to be the status quo. That, in fact, quite likely there's going to be a lot more pressure to keep people out and even perhaps export people who they don't believe should have gotten in the first place.
Domestic politics of Germany aside for the moment, Anna, I'm looking at the future of the European Union. Do you believe the Franco-German axis will assume leadership for not only the robust economic recovery of continental Europe following Brexit, but also, for example, in achieving consensus, if any, with the Americans on the issue of Russia, to recruit Russia again and put it back into the G7 club. The issue was first put forward by President Donald Trump at the G7 club, where he offended almost all the European leaders. They were all opposed to the idea that the Russians should be welcomed back to the club following the assassination attempt of a double agent in the UK, as well as particularly, of course, the annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, well, you have to look at this a little bit broader than just on the European side. I mean, right now Merkel is trying to fend off Donald Trump as he's trying to kill Nord Stream 2, which is very important to gas exports to Europe and things like this. They're also battling a climate accord on trade issues, on Iran, on any number of fronts. There's a real problem. What is the U.S. trying to achieve here? Given the fact that almost everybody except Donald Trump believes that the Russians meddled in the U.S. election, right? Him getting closer to Russia is very odd. But it makes sense from a geopolitical point of view. The U.S. has always thought that it should never allow Russia and China to come together, because this access could be very threatening. You have huge amounts of land, huge population, resources, and manufacturing capability. This is a real threat to the U.S. hegemony, a political, economic, and military hegemony.
Presumably, the Holy Alliance between Russia and China will cement solidarity of Euro-Asia continental Europe. Well, that sounds like a tongue twister, but that's our dialogue on the future or political future of Angela Merkel following the crisis of migration, the part of the domestic politics in Germany. When we come back after the break, we'll look at the RMB and why it has depreciated sharply since China adopted the exchange regime over 1 decade ago. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back. With the US dollar index increasing against other major currencies, the Chinese renminbi has experienced fresh lows against the dollar alongside downward pressure in the Chinese stock market. Though Beijing seeks to implement further reforms in opening up of its financial sector, Chinese authorities have listed curbing financial risks as one of the 3 tough battles they aim to win in the next 3 years. So why does the renminbi continue to devalue against the US dollar? What are the major impacts on the reform and opening up policy, and how will turbulence of the global currencies influence world economic patterns? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio in the second half of the program by Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Robert Kapp, the director of the Economist Corporate Network of our satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome back to our dialogue discussion here. Now, John, the US dollar index increased against other major currencies. RMB has dropped dramatically against this major reserve currency in one single month. I mean, that's a big surprise, if not a wake-up call for the Chinese authorities when they consider seriously how to reform the financial sector. So what are your thoughts on the impact on the financial markets here?
Well, I think the RMB depreciation is very much due to the US dollar getting much stronger, because the interest rate rise in the US, as well as the tax reduction bill in the US, capital is pulling back to the US, and that's making dollar much stronger. And the setting of the value for RMB has a set formula. And this formula has never been disclosed actually, but we know that a big chunk of it from empirical analysis in the intellectual academic world, and we know that a big portion of that weighting is actually US dollar. So from that point of view, the RMB is getting quite weak precipitously in the last few weeks. So that's the background. But in terms of the overall impact on our economy, I don't think our economy is getting a little bit weaker for other reasons, more important reasons than just the currency issue. I think the currency issue actually, from an economics point of view, it helps to stimulate exports, the depreciation of the yen. So I think it may not be bad news, actually.
Pretty clear analysis about the future of RMB and the strength in the broad context of China's import and export. Let me go to Robert Kapp for his analysis about the RMB strength. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Yang Ray.
You know what's happening in China? More and more Chinese want to buy US dollars with RMB, and people can clearly feel the jitters in the stock market, the financial market. So are you surprised about the sharp depreciation of RMB at this moment when the trade war is to break out?
Well, based on what you described there, the brink of a trade war, no, it's not so surprising. I guess what is surprising is that we've come to this stage. The anticipation in the market is that by the end of this week, July 6th, the U.S. will impose $34 billion out of $50 billion in tariffs, and China will respond in kind, and it's not perceiving that well. So I guess the biggest surprise is simply that the two sides haven't resolved their differences. But the net result of a weakening renminbi, in addition to not only the trade tariff issue, also general concerns about bank loans, for example, very large debt in China, these various factors combined. So it's not surprising in that regard.
Are you a fan of a conspiracy theory here, Robert? I mean, this is a question for both of you, John and Robert, that the Chinese monetary authorities like the PBOC have deliberately maneuvered the policy move, engineered the policy move to let RMB slide in value so that negative impact of the trade war will be mitigated. First, Robert.
Well, you can believe that without it being necessarily a conspiracy. Perhaps the U.S. president would describe it as such. He has often criticized China for manipulating the currency. But that idea of helping the renminbi yuan devalue in the face of a trade war, just as Professor Gong was talking about, actually makes a lot of sense. It boosts China's export capability. So, and that's done elsewhere. Abenomics is premised on a depreciating yen, Japanese yen. So it's not like China's the only country doing that.
I haven't bought into the conspiracy theory yet because, early in the year, renminbi appreciated quite a similar pattern, drastically increased from 1 to close to 7 to down to 6.25, I believe, just in a few days actually. So this is not the first time we see this kind of a movement, and just the magnitude of the movement, from 6.3 to 6.65 right now, about 6.65 in less than 2 weeks it's not something can be called as a conspiracy theory. But I think.
But don't you think this could be viewed as a trial balloon released deliberately by the Chinese authorities to let Donald Trump, understand? Look, this is something we can do. Okay.
Yeah, that I agree. I think it can be interpreted that way. That it can be interpreted. It can be possibly interpreted that way. That the Chinese government is sending a signal that the currency issue itself can be used as a vehicle, as an instrument to counter the impact of the technology.
Right. It's one of the policy options or tools in the box.
Right. But I think it has to be. It has this. It's a double-edged sword. I don't think it's always sort of in the Chinese advantage by depreciating yen to a big extent. Because there's also a large cost as well. China is a big importer of raw materials, oil and gas and other mineral materials. So our imports are actually increasing much faster than our exports. So on the other side, it's also having a burden on the Chinese economy as well. In addition to that, we are seeing more and more Chinese tourists going abroad. We see a lot of...
That's bad news for Chinese tourists.
That's very bad news for tourists. And also we have a very booming...
I'm planning a holiday next day.
I just came back from Mauritius, actually. But anyway, I want to also mention that we have a lot of international students going to the U.S., going to Europe to study. And their tuition bill is piling up as well, right? So it's not always something that the Chinese government is so willing to use. It's something that it probably has to use when it's cornered.
Robert, do you think that there is a legitimate basis for further devaluation of RMB short term?
Well, it seems to be heading in that direction. At the same time, today was notable for not only the renminbi crashing through the psychologically important 6.7 barrier, but then the PBOC seems to have acted to prop it back up. So there is concern, I believe, by the Chinese authorities for showing too much weakness in the yuan. Of course, the long-term goal for China is to globalize the renminbi and have it become its own safe haven. It's a long ways away from that, but in order to do that, you have to have people believe in the value and that it's stable. So there's a lot of countervailing pressure for the depreciation to not be too drastic.
By the way, Robert, you don't think that the Chinese authorities will be coming under fire and pressure from the U.S. government? I'm talking about the trade war, so that the capital account will be forced open.
Well, certainly the capital account is something that not only Washington has talked about, but the rest of the world and China itself. Liu He at Davos famously talked about reforms that would surprise the world, and then in April at the Boao Forum we heard about the financial sector opening up. So the capital account seems set for opening. It would be tragic if that was restricted because of the trade tensions, but it's also understandable in that context. But for China's long-term benefit, opening the capital account is a good thing, and that will indeed put pressure on the renminbi either to go up or down according to market forces as opposed to policy moves.
Many people here in China, I mean elites who know what's going on between the United States and China, the two biggest economies, they point out the trade war, which is to break out pretty soon, is not necessarily a bad thing, because there is currently an ongoing national policy debate as to whether the trade war will deliver more negative impact or the other way around in terms of, as I said earlier, further opening up of the capital account and the financial industry, so on and so forth. And this trade war might be used as a catalyst for further or deep reform of the Chinese economy. What do you think of such allegations?
Well, I mean, trade was always bad. I mean, tariffs is not going to be good to the economy. But I think you're right that the pressure to open up more Chinese economies is actually not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. I think the financial market opening up they're talking about is more about opening up the market for foreign investors coming to China to open up financial institutions, investing in China. This is actually quite different from opening up the capital account market. And I think we have to be, here we're talking about the phased approach to RMB internationalization being a fully convertible currency. And I think that has to be very cautious, I think. There are many lessons in history that it can cause catastrophic effect if it's not done right. And China is a huge economy. And you know that people in China, they're quite rich and they have a lot of capital and tend to move money around. They're very smart about this. So I think if it's not done correctly, not appropriately, it can be very risky. So I think that's a little bit different from opening up the market where, that's something that Mr. Liu He was talking about. He's talking about opening up the financial market for foreign investors, American bankers and financial institutions to come into China to invest. And when it comes to the RMB total convertibility, internationalization, I'm fully of the camp that we have to take a phased approach, move gradually instead of having something like a shock and awe therapy. That's kind of dangerous to me.
Robert, here is a very interesting issue for both of you to look at, which comes across as the lesser evil. Further internationalization of the RMB or our continuous reliance on the US dollar as the major reserve currency, as well as for settlement of all the major transactions?
Well, both seem inevitable to me to a certain degree, but I can tell you I would bet my money on the US dollar remaining reserve currency for a long time. I don't say that because I'm a United States citizen, but because that's just the way it's been, and there are lots of fundamental reasons for it continuing as such. The renminbi, to Professor Gong's point, yes, there's advantages to managing gradually this releasing of the capital controls, but at some point they're going to have to be more released than they are now, because otherwise you're never going to have much influence with the renminbi, and then China will be beholden on the US dollar. Currently the US government's largest owner of government bonds is China, so it's an example of the sort of mutual reliance that goes on.
I think the U.S. government has a sort of a double-sided attitude towards this issue. On one side, it certainly wants to encourage RMB becoming more internationalized and being fully convertible currency. As a matter of fact, in the U.S. Department of Commerce assessment of China being a full market economy status, one of the very important criteria is the fully convertibility of its currency. But on the other hand, I do believe that from the U.S. government's perspective, saying that RMB becoming an international currency, especially becoming a dominant international currency, is more of a lip service than its true wish. From the U.S. government's perspective, it doesn't want any currency, EU's Euro included, to be a dominant currency to challenge the U.S. dollar's international status. That's just something catastrophic for the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy has a very large fiscal deficit. It prints money, basically, to finance its public expenditures. So I think from that perspective, championing a fully convertible RMB is more of a lip service from U.S. government's perspective, in our opinion.
Pretty soon, the RMB will drop below 7 US dollar. That's the widespread speculation. However, I'm looking at the future of the forex reserves. Of course, with the trade war,
$3 trillion.
The $3 trillion. I mean, our current account will soon drop because the Trump administration will not allow China to enjoy the huge trade surplus as we did for years. So what's going to happen to the $3 trillion?
Well, I think that there's two things going on right now. On the one side, Donald Trump doesn't want RMB to depreciate too much, and let's make sure for that. And he wants every time RMB depreciates a lot, he calls China currency manipulator. So this is one perspective. The second perspective is that the trade surplus from China's perspective is not going to be sustainably large as in the past. It's going to shrink. So from that perspective, I think the foreign exchange reserve in the U.S. is not going to get larger anymore. it's going to keep shrinking. But that puts pressure on RMB, right? That puts pressure on RMB. But on the other hand, politically, it doesn't want the Chinese government to depreciate too much. So I think it's going to be sort of counteracting forces at play here. We'll see what's going to happen. You know, the prediction that's going to drop below 7. I think, you know, truly, I don't believe that the Chinese government want to see its currency to be below 7 too much for, you know, for sustainable period of time. So I think the Chinese government still, after all, RMB is still a control currency. It's still some control from a government perspective, from a capital account perspective. So I think it still has some leeway to pop up RMB, not to drop below 7. That's my guess.
Let me go back to Robert. Mr. Yi Gang, the top banker, says at the press release recently that the current cross-border transactions of the currencies looks fine. The central bank is able to make sure that nothing would go wrong. However, with the impact of the tax reform of the Trump administration, what do you think of the growing momentum of the outbound capital flight, and what is the impact upon the RMB?
Well, there's certainly pressure for capital movement out of China, not only because of tax reforms in the United States, but in particular that depreciation, that's, you know, the forces are there bringing the value of the renminbi down. And then, like I mentioned, some of the other concerns about the economy generally. An investor would, in that, you know, facing that future, look to move money out. And I think that's going to continue. As you were just talking about, Yang Rui, a lot of people are predicting below 7. For the exchange rate, and in that case, people are going to want to take money out. Those pressures will remain for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. The stronger U.S. dollar is said to be backed up by strong, robust economic recovery of the U.S. Now, the U.S. Federal Reserve's interest rate hike earlier this month also serves as a shot in the arm for investors, and given the impact of the flow of money back to the United States, we don't know. We're not sure what's going to happen next to RMB. Well, that's a big question mark. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.